Just a nurse. That's what they'd call her if they knew. That's what everyone called her. Dr. Raymond Mercer had already started calling her that in his head. Elena could feel it like pressure building behind her eyes. She didn't know yet that in 72 hours he would stand in a hospital corridor and say those exact words out loud to a room full of residents, his voice dripping condescension while she stood perfectly still and did not flinch. She didn't know that a man was about to crash through the doors of St. Michael's Memorial with a collapsed lung and 17 minutes of consciousness left, and that saving his life would unravel 3 years of the most carefully constructed invisibility of her career. The August heat on I-10 outside San Antonio was 103 degrees. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, shimmering like water that wasn't there. Elena Martinez pulled her decade-old Honda Civic onto the shoulder at 2:38 p.m., the same moment a Chevrolet Silverado finished its violent arc through the median guardrail. The truck came to rest on its roof, metal screaming as it settled, the sound like something alive and suffering. Other drivers did what drivers do, they accelerated past, eyes forward, music still playing, the highway swallowing the moment whole. Elena cut her engine and stepped out into air thick enough to choke on. Her shift at St. Michael's didn't start until 11 p.m. She had 8 hours and 13 minutes of free time, which meant 8 hours and 13 minutes of being just another person on the road, just another nurse in scrubs with coffee stains on her shoulder from the morning rush. She was wrong about the stains being just coffee. The drive took 40 minutes down I-37 south and she never looked at her scrubs closely enough to notice the small worn patch near her left clavicle where she'd once used her sleeve to wipe blood from her face during a field dressing situation that had involved 14 casualties and direct fire and a Taliban sniper whose shots were getting closer with each rotation. That was 2011. That was Tikrit. That was before she learned how to disappear into a uniform so convincingly that no one, not in 3 years at St. Michael's, had looked at her long enough to see what was underneath. The Silverado's windshield was still intact, which was both a blessing and a terrible sign. Elena approached the wreckage with the kind of calculated assessment most nurses never develop. She was already scanning the median for secondary threats, already plotting exit routes, already noting the distance to the nearest hospital. Her hands moved through the muscle memory of it before her mind caught up. Captain Elena Martinez, 75th Ranger Regiment, field-qualified surgical medic, had treated casualties under fire in the Jolin district. Tonight she was just the woman who stopped to help. The driver was unconscious, his chest rising and falling in a pattern that told her everything. His sternum was fractured, she could see the way his ribs moved independently of his chest wall, the paradoxical breathing of a man whose lungs were drowning him from the inside. But it was the sucking chest wound below his left clavicle that made her move faster. Air was entering the pleural space with each breath, collapsing his left lung, and the timing was ticking down like a bomb. She didn't call 911 yet. She reached through the broken window and found his carotid pulse, present, thread-thin, racing at 128 beats per minute. His systolic pressure was probably already in the 50s. She had maybe 10 minutes before the pressure in his chest cavity would reverse the blood flow in his vena cava and his heart would simply stop. She'd seen it happen twice before, both times in operating theaters where there were surgeons standing by. She was standing by a totaled truck on a highway where the nearest level 1 trauma center was 41 miles away. Elena moved like water finding the lowest point. She pulled the driver's door open, it took both hands but the hinges were already compromised by impact, and reached across his body. The sucking wound was exactly where she'd thought it would be, air whistling through torn muscle and fractured ribs with a sound like a tiny storm. The smell of diesel and blood and burnt rubber filled the space. She applied direct pressure with her right hand, her palm flat against the wound, and the air stopped escaping. His eyes remained closed. His name was Staff Sergeant Cole Brennan, 75th Ranger Regiment, same unit where Elena had earned her Silver Star for treating casualties under direct fire. She didn't know his name yet. She just knew his bleeding pattern, his respiratory status, the dilating pupil on his left side that suggested concussion or worse. She called 911 with her left hand while keeping pressure with her right. Her voice came out steady, trained, practiced, the voice of someone who had done this 100 times in 100 emergency rooms. I have a male, approximately 30s, single vehicle rollover, Unresponsive, sucking chest wound left anterior, approximately 2 centimeters diameter, paradoxical breathing pattern, tachycardic, pale, clammy. I'm a registered nurse. I have direct pressure on the wound. How long is your ETA? The dispatcher was asking questions. Elena answered them all while her right hand stayed exactly where it was and her left hand reached into her work bag for supplies she wasn't technically supposed to be carrying as a night shift nurse at St. Michael's. A trauma shear. A 14-gauge angiocath. Pressure dressings sealed in sterile packages. A belt she could use for a tourniquet if the hemorrhage changed pattern. ETA is 9 minutes, the dispatcher said. Stay on the line. Elena's hands moved with the kind of precision that belonged in a surgical theater. She worked through his shirt with the shears, exposing the wound fully, assessing the lung recoil beneath the edges of the laceration. No bubbles of air escaping anymore, she'd achieved a seal. She applied an occlusive dressing, the plastic crinkle loud in the sudden silence when traffic finally slowed enough for people to start paying attention. Rubber gloves snapped on. Fingers moving. The dressing adhering. His breathing already easier. By the time the ambulance appeared in her peripheral vision, she had established a pressure point for his radial artery, intact, thank God, and begun a rapid assessment of his abdomen. Distended. Rigid. He was bleeding internally, somewhere below the diaphragm, and the timeline just got tighter. 9 minutes turned into 6 by the time the paramedics reached them, and Elena stepped back without being asked, her hand still steady, her expression still neutral. She was just a nurse who'd stopped to help. One of the paramedics did a double-take at her pressure dressing. Not the technique, the dressing itself, applied with the kind of precision that didn't come from standard nursing school. She was already walking away, already pulling off her gloves, already becoming invisible again by the time he might have asked questions she couldn't answer. She drove to St. Michael's Memorial instead of going home. Her shift didn't start for another 4 hours and 42 minutes, but the protocol existed for a reason. Monitor the patient. Make sure the mission didn't get blown at the point of injury. Make sure the cover held. The ER at St. Michael's was controlled chaos the way emergency rooms always are, sterile and efficient and full of people moving with purpose. Elena changed into a fresh set of scrubs in the locker room. The coffee stain was on her left shoulder, right where the scar tissue began, and she caught her reflection in the mirror long enough to see someone she didn't recognize. When had she learned to make her face look like that? So neutral. So empty. So perfectly, completely unremarkable. Dr. Raymond Mercer was already waiting in the bay, checking his Rolex with the kind of visible irritation that suggested he'd been waiting at least 3 minutes too long for a patient who hadn't even arrived yet. He was tall, built the way men look when they've never had to fight for anything, and his scrubs had creases that suggested they were pressed fresh this morning. 62 years old, according to the hospital roster. Harvard Medical School. Board-certified trauma surgeon. Husband to Patricia Mercer, philanthropist, whose father had endowed the entire West Wing of St. Michael's in 1987. Elena stayed at the far end of the bay and began pulling supplies, her movements economical, her presence the kind of background furniture that good nurses learn to become. The arrival alert sounded. Ambulance 3 minutes out. That's when she heard Dr. Mercer say something low to the attending resident beside him, something about the Good Samaritan nurse who'd probably done more harm than good with whatever field dressing she'd improvised. Elena's jaw tightened, just barely, a tremor that didn't show anywhere except in the precise way her hands paused for exactly one breath before resuming. She'd survived worse than condescension. She'd survived worse than everything. But she didn't know yet that 3 years of invisible work was about to collide with the one man in the ICU who could undo her whole operation, and that the person who would save him would be her, and that the person who would try to destroy her for it would be the man checking his Rolex across the room, and that 72 hours from now, a helicopter would arrive at St. Michael's Memorial with enough authority to change everything. The ambulance bay doors opened. Rain started falling outside, hard enough to hammer the parking lot like applause. The moment stretched like it was holding its breath. 3 days later, the grand rounds began like every other morning, fluorescent lights humming their mechanical song, 20 residents standing in rigid rows behind attending physicians like soldiers awaiting inspection. Dr. Raymond Mercer stood at the head of St. Michael's ICU conference room, Elena's charting in his hands, his voice already carrying that particular edge that made junior doctors flinch. He held up the papers as if they were contaminated. "This," Mercer announced, his tone dripping with the kind of condescension that only came from someone absolutely certain of his superiority, "is unacceptable documentation that creates liability gaps. Nurse Martinez, did they teach you to write incomplete sentences at whatever nursing program accepted you, or were you absent that day?" The words landed like a slap. 17 residents smirked. One whispered, "Target practice," loud enough for the entire room to hear. The nickname spread instantly, rippling through the crowd like a contagion. Target practice. Because she couldn't hit the mark with basic charting. Because a night shift nurse wasn't worth the oxygen she breathed. Elena stood motionless at the back of the room, her hands at her sides, her breathing steady as a metronome. She had absorbed worse. In Tikrit, she'd taken shrapnel that had torn through 3 layers of body armor. A physician's contempt was nothing compared to incoming fire. But this wasn't about the charting, and they both knew it. Mercer knew that she'd been reviewing supply invoices during her shifts, phantom shipments that didn't align with actual equipment deliveries to the hospital. He knew that she'd noticed the pattern, overcharges to vendors, invoices paid but equipment never arriving, a kickback scheme so obvious it made her wonder why no one else had seen it. Or perhaps they had. Perhaps they'd simply chosen not to look. She took one measured breath. Just one. Her eyes remained locked on Mercer's as something shifted in her posture, not visibly, but the way a predator shifts weight before moving. The room felt it. Several residents stopped smirking. "I'd be happy to review the full documentation trail with you, Doctor," Elena said, her voice level as a surgical laser. "Including supply orders." Mercer's jaw tightened. His hand gripped the charting papers so hard his knuckles went white. The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then he turned away, muttering something about protocol violations, and the grand rounds continued with everyone pretending that nothing had happened. But that wasn't the worst part. That afternoon, Elena stood in front of the vending machine on the 3rd floor, inserting quarters with methodical precision. The machines always jammed. Today it jammed on purpose, as if the universe wanted her to be trapped there when Mercer walked past with 2 surgical residents trailing behind him like pilot fish following a shark. "Target practice is still here." Mercer's voice carried across the corridor with calculated loudness. "I thought security would have escorted her out by now, like they did the last nurse who thought she was smarter than physicians." The residents laughed. It was the kind of laughter that belonged in middle schools, not in a level 1 trauma center. Elena watched her black coffee drop into the slot with a mechanical thud. She didn't rush. She collected the cup. She turned. Mercer and his resident stood 3 feet away, their expressions already shifting because they could see something in her eyes that hadn't been there during grand rounds. The deferential night shift nurse was still present, but behind her stood someone else entirely. "I've escorted people before, Doctor," Elena said quietly. "I know what that looks like." The words were soft. The words were measured. The words were delivered in a voice that had called in air support under direct fire, that had ordered men twice her size to move faster, that had held the gravitas of someone who understood exactly what it meant to remove someone from a location. Mercer's face flushed crimson. One of the residents actually stepped backward. Elena sipped her coffee without breaking eye contact, and in that moment, in that single, crystalline moment, something shifted in the hospital's understanding of who she was. But Mercer wasn't finished building his case. Not even close. That night, an emergency appendectomy came through the doors at 9:53 p.m., a 34-year-old construction worker with peritoneal sepsis, fever of 104.2, and exactly 1 hour before organ failure became inevitable. Elena assisted, standing across the surgical table from a visiting trauma surgeon from Fort Sam Houston, a man whose nameplate read Captain Holloway, whose hands moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd worked in field conditions. Mid-suture, mid-procedure, his hands froze. He was staring at her four-finger vascular clamp technique, the way she held the clamp with her thumb and three fingers while applying counter-pressure with her palm in a way that no standard nursing protocol taught. It was a technique born in a field hospital outside Tikrit, refined through 214 emergency procedures in a tent with sand blowing through the fabric and mortars landing 300 meters away. Captain Holloway's eyes went very still. "Your 75th Regiment," he whispered, barely audible over the anesthesia machine's rhythmic breathing. "I saw you work in the field hospital outside Tikrit." Elena met his eyes for precisely 1 second. She gave a tiny shake of her head, the smallest movement, a plea for silence written in muscle and bone. He understood. He nodded, looked back at the surgical field, and never said another word. But they both knew that the truth had been named. The secret was out. And Dr. Mercer noticed the exchange. From his position at the nurse's station, reviewing charts that he wasn't actually looking at, Mercer saw the freeze. He saw the whispered words. He saw Elena's head shake and Holloway's nod. He didn't hear the words, but he knew something had shifted, and in a man like Mercer, in a man whose power was built on institutional leverage rather than actual competence, that knowledge was more dangerous than a direct threat. The appendectomy finished at 10:33 p.m. The patient's vitals stabilized. His fever would drop by morning. He would leave St. Michael's in 7 days with a post-operative infection rate of 0.4%, which was roughly half the national average. Elena had ensured that. But she had also ensured that she'd just revealed her military background to someone other than herself. Mercer made 3 phone calls that night. The first was to Dr. Patricia Valdez, the chief medical officer, a woman who owed Mercer more than she wanted anyone to know, probably involving billing irregularities of her own. The second was to Marcus Chen, the hospital's litigation attorney, a man whose retainer Mercer had significantly padded over the past 18 months. The third was to the Texas Board of Nursing, where Mercer had cultivated a relationship with a senior licensing investigator named Patricia Kowalski, a woman who had once needed a recommendation from someone with Mercer's standing when her daughter was applying to medical school. He didn't mention the charting. He didn't mention the supply invoices. He crafted a narrative with surgical precision, an unstable employee with a dangerous hero complex, a tendency toward unauthorized procedures, concerning behavior patterns that suggested she was a risk to patient safety. He didn't lie. He simply shaped the truth like a sculptor shapes marble, removing everything inconvenient until only the silhouette remained. By 11:15 p.m., Elena had been reassigned to overnight inventory duty in the basement pharmacy, restricted from all patient contact, pending investigation. By midnight, the witness protection mission that had taken 3 years to establish was completely compromised. She sat in the basement surrounded by bottles and syringes and pharmaceutical supplies stacked to the ceiling, her phone in her hand, waiting for the message she already knew was coming. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry wasps. The smell of antiseptic and plastic packaging hung in the recycled air like a requiem. Everything smelled like goodbye. Her handler's message arrived at 12:16 a.m., cover blown, mission scrubbed, you're burned. The quietest person in the room might just be holding it all together. The ER doors burst open at 11:22 p.m., and the stretcher came through like a torpedo, the same man Elena had pulled from the overturned pickup truck on I-10 3 days ago, now code red, his lungs collapsing like a building imploding. Staff Sergeant Cole Brennan's oxygen saturation flickered across the monitor, 78, 71, 64. His chest heaved with the desperate mechanics of a body drowning in air. The attending physician, a grey-haired cardiologist named Chen, shouted for the on-call thoracic surgeon, but the intercom crackled back immediately, thoracic is in surgery. Emergency esophageal repair. Won't be available for 40 minutes. 40 minutes. Cole Brennan didn't have 40 minutes. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, but his oxygen was dropping faster than the algorithm could compensate. His blood pressure tanked, 88/52. The resident, a third-year named Morrison who looked like he'd never seen a real crisis, froze beside the monitor, his hands trembling as he reached for the crash cart. Elena stood in the corner of Trauma Bay 4, supposed to be observing, not participating, still in the pharmacy inventory paperwork clothes that marked her as restricted from patient care. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, creating a sound like electricity trapped in glass. "Push 2 milligrams midazolam," Dr. Chen ordered, but his voice carried the tremor of a man about to lose a patient. "Get me fiber optic intubation. We need to visualize the airway." But Brennan's O2 sat dropped to 52. His lips turned the color of storm clouds. Elena didn't think. She moved. The crash cart was 4 feet away. She crossed the distance like water finding gravity, no hesitation, no permission asking. Her hands found the scalpel tray. The 15-blade knife gleamed under the trauma lights, and when she looked up, Dr. Mercer was standing in the doorway of the bay, his expression shifting from shock to something uglier. "Absolutely not," he said. His voice wasn't loud. It was worse than loud, it was controlled. Clinical. The voice of someone confident in his authority. "Step away from that patient. Now." Elena's hands didn't stop moving. She prepped Brennan's chest, the 4th intercostal space, left anterior axillary line, with betadine in 7 seconds. The soldier on the stretcher was still conscious enough to feel it. His eyes found hers for just a moment, and something passed between them, recognition. Understanding. The look between people who'd seen the same kind of bad. "I will have security remove you," Mercer continued, stepping into the bay now, his tone sharpening to something acidic. "This is an unauthorized procedure performed by a nurse who is currently restricted from patient care. Every second of this is lawsuit exposure. Every second is negligence." Elena pressed the blade to Brennan's skin. The resistance was less than she expected, skin always was more yielding than civilians assumed. The incision went down through the fascia in one clean stroke. No trembling. No hesitation. Her hands moved like they were remembering something they'd done 100 times before. Because they had. Outside Tikrit, in a field hospital that was nothing more than canvas and prayer, with casualties bleeding out faster than the supply line could replace them. Blood welled up, dark and arterial bright. The resident Morrison made a small sound like a muted scream. "Get me a rib spreader," Elena said. Her voice had changed. It wasn't the deferential nurse voice from the supply basement. It was the voice of someone who'd watched people die and learned how to prevent it. And a 4.0 absorbable. Dr. Chen didn't move to stop her. He understood, in the way that seasoned physicians do, when the person holding the knife knows something everyone else in the room doesn't. He reached for the spreader himself. The metal tool went in, the ribs spreading open like a door, and Elena's eyes followed the anatomy she'd learned not in textbooks but in the rain-soaked dust of a FOB, learning how to keep a sergeant with a gunshot wound to the thorax breathing for the 3 hours it took the medevac helicopter to arrive. "This is a protocol violation," Mercer said, but his voice had lost its certainty. He was still talking, still trying to maintain authority, but he was talking to someone who wasn't listening anymore. Elena's attention had narrowed to a single point, the collapsed left lung, the tension pneumothorax that had been killing this man by degrees. She found the pulmonary hilum with the kind of spatial awareness that came from having done this before, in worse light, with worse odds. Her forefingers went in, the clamp technique her teacher had called the most efficient method for vascular occlusion without crushing tissue. The fingers of her left hand became an instrument, precise and bloodless in their execution. Morrison was staring like he was watching someone speak a language they weren't supposed to know. Residents in the other bays had stopped what they were doing. The room was dead silent except for the monitor and the whisper of air escaping as she inserted the chest tube. The tube went in at the 5th intercostal space. The hiss of air releasing was like opening a door to somewhere pressurized. Cole Brennan's oxygen saturation climbed, 58, 61, 68, 74, 82. His blood pressure began to stabilize. The monitor showed what looked almost like a heartbeat instead of a panic attack. Elena closed the wound with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times across 2 continents. Sutures. Dressing. Confirmation that the tube was patent and draining. 37 minutes from the time she'd cracked his chest. The resident Morrison was pale enough to be a surgical candidate himself. "Get him to ICU," Elena said, stepping back from the table. "Contact trauma surgery. He'll need a thoracotomy in the next 4 hours or the bleeding will start again." She turned to face Dr. Mercer, who was still standing in the doorway with his hands at his sides, his mouth moving without sound coming out. Elena peeled off the trauma gloves. The latex snapped like small gunshots in the silence. There was blood on her hands, Brennan's blood, and she could have felt something about that, but feeling was a luxury for people who had time. "Unauthorized procedure," she said quietly. "I heard you the first time." Dr. Chen was staring at her now too, the way people stare at something that has shifted the entire axis of their understanding of who you are. The trauma attending, a woman named Dr. Santos who'd been reviewing the monitor from the observation window, was walking toward the bay with an expression that suggested she'd just witnessed something that didn't fit into the institutional hierarchy she'd spent 15 years navigating. But Elena was already moving. She peeled off the surgical gown. She set it in the biohazard bin with the same careful precision she did everything. The room seemed to be vibrating at a frequency that only she could hear. Dr. Mercer stepped aside to let her pass, and the look on his face was something between fury and fear. He understood, in that moment, that whatever he'd thought he was dealing with for the past 72 hours, he'd been wrong. He understood it with the clarity of someone who'd just seen the mask slip and glimpsed what was underneath. 20 minutes later, Elena was sitting in the hospital administrator's office, a sterile room on the 3rd floor with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking San Antonio's skyline. The administrator was a man named Gerald Hutchins, 58 years old, with the look of someone whose job was mostly about managing lawsuits and personnel files. He sat across from her with both hands flat on his desk like he was ready to spring away from something dangerous. Dr. Mercer was pacing behind her, and now his voice had shifted again. Now it was desperate, which was worse than when it was arrogant. Desperate people made mistakes, but they also became unpredictable. He was describing Elena as unstable, as a risk, as someone with a hero complex who couldn't distinguish between protocol and impulse. He was using words like unauthorized, negligent, dangerous. He was building something out of language, a structure designed to contain and isolate her. The patient would have died, Dr. Chen said quietly. He'd come to the administrator's office too, which meant the ship had shifted. Mercer had lost control of the narrative, which meant he was improvising now, calling in favors and allies like a man throwing everything he had at a wall and hoping something stuck. But Mercer was smart. Elena understood that now. Smart and systematic. He was making calls, she could hear his phone vibrating in his pocket like a heart in distress, and each call was to someone who owed him something. The chief medical officer. The hospital's risk management attorney. The credentials committee at the Texas Board of Nursing. He was constructing a narrative and running it through channels, and he was doing it in such a way that by the time anyone could verify the facts, the institutional machinery would have already judged and convicted. He reassigned her to basement pharmacy inventory, permanent restriction from patient care, pending investigation. He had 2 nurses who'd witnessed the thoracotomy transfer to the night shift on different floors, ensuring they could never coordinate a statement. He removed her name from the surgical schedule for the next 60 days. He sent emails to department heads about a pattern of insubordination and poor judgment, words carefully chosen to accumulate weight through repetition. He was the slow machinery of institutional power, grinding not with sudden violence but with the inexorable pressure of bureaucratic process. Elena sat in the basement pharmacy at 1:23 a.m., counting bottles of metoprolol in the fluorescent hum. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was steady. She'd been in worse positions than this, had stared down worse odds, but that didn't make this hurt less. The thing about undercover work was that the mask became real after a while. The civilian nurse named Elena Martinez, the night shift worker who filled out charting correctly and didn't ask questions, had started to feel like her actual life instead of her cover. At 2:15 a.m., her phone, a burner issued by JSOC, vibrated once. A single encrypted message, cover blown. Mission scrubbed. You're burned. The words hit like a punch to the solar plexus. 3 years. 3 years of holding a cover identity, of watching the ICU patient, a cartel accountant who'd agreed to testify against one of the largest trafficking networks in the Southwest, waiting for the right moment to extract him to federal protection. 3 years of being no one, of being just a nurse, of being dismissed and underestimated and scorned. 3 years of waiting for this to mean something. Gone. The handler's next message came at 2:08 a.m., extract team EOD. Transition window 48 hours. Clear your locker and leave no trace. Elena stood up. The pharmacy was silent except for the ambient hum of the refrigeration units keeping insulin and nitroglycerine at exactly the right temperature. She had 20 minutes to erase herself from the civilian world. 20 minutes to pack up the life she'd constructed with such careful precision. Her locker was on the 3rd floor, in the nurse's break room. She opened it and looked at what she'd accumulated, the cracked coffee mug that said "World's Okayest Nurse" in faded letters, purchased at a pharmacy gift shop in month 3. A dying succulent that she'd tried to keep alive but hadn't quite managed, its leaves were turning transparent at the edges. And the folded flag, the one that had been presented to the family of Captain James Reeves, 75th Ranger Regiment, KIA outside Tikrit, her teammate, the one who'd taught her the 4-finger vascular clamp technique during their first tour together. She packed them in the cardboard box the hospital used for personal belongings. At 2:51 a.m., she walked out through the employee entrance. The rain was coming down in that particular way that Texas storms do, horizontal and furious, like something with a grudge. The parking lot was empty except for her decade-old Honda, which the extraction team was supposed to take at 3:48 a.m. They'd strip it for any surveillance equipment, any traces that Elena Martinez had ever existed as a discrete entity. The vehicle would disappear the same way she was disappearing, completely, leaving nothing but absence. Elena stood at the bus stop on Fredericksburg Road at 3:07 a.m., the cardboard box clutched against her chest. The rain ran down her face and mixed with something that might have been tears, the kind of tears she'd learned not to cry in the light of day. She looked at her reflection in the dark glass of the bus shelter and saw a woman who'd saved lives on 2 continents and now had nothing to show for it except 3 objects in a cardboard box and a military call sign that meant Reaper, the sniper who made the hard kills that others couldn't. The rain hammered the shelter like applause for a performance no one would ever see. She had no idea what was about to change everything. The cardboard box felt heavier than it should have. Elena sat on the metal bench at the bus stop on Fredericksburg Road, rain hammering the plastic shelter like applause for a performance no one would ever see. The box contained everything: a cracked coffee mug that read "World's Okayest Nurse" in faded letters, a wilting succulent with brown-edged leaves, and a folded flag from Specialist Marcus Chen, her team medic, killed by an IED outside Tikrit 4 years ago. The flag never left her locker. Until tonight. Her phone had buzzed at 11:44 p.m. with a message from her handler, encrypted across JSOC secure network. 5 words. Cover blown. Mission scrubbed. You're burned. 20 minutes to pack her civilian life and leave. 20 minutes. She'd walked past her own apartment on the hospital's 3rd floor, the one registered under the name Elena Martinez, RN, with 3 years of tax returns and a signed lease, and simply kept walking. Took the stairs down 6 flights because elevators could be monitored. Clocked out on a time card that would be the last official record of her existence at St. Michael's Memorial. The night shift supervisor didn't even look up. Rain slicked the sidewalk. A car passed on Fredericksburg Road, its headlights briefly illuminating her face in the bus shelter glass. She barely recognized herself. 3 years of deferential posture, lowered eyes, the careful construction of a woman who existed to serve. A woman without history. Without identity. Without purpose beyond watching Cole Brennan sleep in the ICU and making sure his location stayed secure. That's what had killed the mission. Not Elena. Not the thoracotomy she'd performed to keep him breathing. Someone else had talked. The witness protection assignment had been her escape hatch, theoretically. 3 years embedded at a civilian hospital, watching a high-value patient under federal protection, maintaining her cover as an ordinary night shift nurse while JSOC monitored threats from distance. It was supposed to be simple. Invisible. Safe. The kind of operation where the operative never gets recognized, never gets exposed, never gets extracted at a bus stop in the rain with a cardboard box. But Dr. Raymond Mercer had changed that. She could still see his face from this morning when hospital security had escorted her to the basement pharmacy. The chief medical officer had signed the reassignment order without reading it, barely glancing at Mercer's explanation about protocol violations and documentation gaps. The legal counsel had stamped it with institutional authority. Mercer had smiled, that practiced smile of someone who understood institutional power the way a surgeon understands anatomy. He'd placed a hand on her shoulder as she left the ICU, a gesture meant to look friendly. "You're going to inventory duty, Elena. Night shift, basement level. The antibiotics won't count themselves." His voice had carried the precision of someone executing a surgical plan. "Effective immediately. Security will ensure you don't access patient records or controlled substances without explicit authorization." It wasn't a promotion. It was isolation. A cage designed to keep her away from the ICU, away from Cole Brennan, away from the federal marshals who checked on her twice weekly. Mercer had understood what she was before she'd even finished saving his life. The conversation had lasted 34 seconds. She'd worked inventory for exactly 8 hours. Scanning barcodes. Counting vials of vancomycin and ceftriaxone. The basement smelled of antiseptic and industrial fluorescent light, that particular hum that made her teeth ache. Around 4 a.m., her handler's message had come through on the burner phone she kept in her sock, the one that nobody, not hospital administration, not JSOC, not even the federal marshals, knew existed. They'd taught her well. Dead drops, signal protocols, communications that left no digital footprint. Cover blown. Mission scrubbed. You're burned. Which meant someone had talked. Someone at the hospital, someone who understood federal protection protocols, someone with access to witness security databases and the authority to query them without raising flags. Someone like a physician with institutional credentials and connections to private security contractors. Someone like Mercer. She'd walked out of the pharmacy at 4:23 a.m., past the night custodians who knew better than to look at her twice, past the security checkpoint where the guard was on his phone. She'd entered her apartment, the cover apartment, for the last time. Opened the lockbox hidden behind the bathroom tile. Took the go bag that had been packed for exactly this scenario, $8,400 in cash, 3 passports, a prepaid debit card, and a burner laptop wiped of identifying information. But she'd also taken the cardboard box with her civilian life. The mug had been a joke from her first week at St. Michael's. A nurse named David had given it to her, back when Elena was still learning the choreography of being someone else. The succulent had been on the break room windowsill, dying and forgotten, and she'd watered it every shift because even undercover operatives noticed things that needed saving. The folded flag had been in her locker since the day she'd arrived, a photograph of Marcus, a reminder of why she was here, why she was willing to disappear into someone else's life for 3 years. She stared at her reflection in the dark bus shelter glass. Saw a woman with olive skin and dark hair and eyes that had watched 14 casualties bleed out under mortar fire. Saw a woman who'd held a field hospital together with nothing but discipline and saline and the kind of composure that came from having already survived the worst. Saw a woman who'd become nobody at all. The rain hammered harder. A siren wailed somewhere on the San Antonio grid, getting closer, then fading. Probably not for her. Probably just the city turning over in its sleep, indifferent to the fact that Captain Elena Martinez had been erased. She'd spent 3 years protecting someone else's life. Cole Brennan had no idea who she was. The federal marshals had no idea that she was extracted instead of reassigned. Mercer had no idea that she'd already left before he filed the formal termination paperwork with the Board of Nursing, the paperwork that had probably arrived in her personnel file around the same time she was packing the cardboard box. 3 years undercover. 365 nights of being less than what she was. 3,000 medical decisions made with the hands of someone trained to operate on battlefields, constrained into the narrow space of a hospital role that demanded she defer to administrators and physicians and insurance protocols. And it had meant nothing at all. The bus arrived at 12:34 a.m., air brakes hissing like oxygen escaping a puncture wound. The driver barely glanced at her as she boarded. She took a seat in the back, the cardboard box balanced on her lap, and watched San Antonio dissolve into rain and darkness through the smeared window. Somewhere in the city, Cole Brennan was sleeping off the effects of anesthesia in a hospital bed, his lungs finally full of air instead of blood. His brother was probably flying home to San Diego. The federal marshals were probably still monitoring his room, oblivious to the fact that their cover was blown. And Dr. Mercer was probably sleeping, confident that he'd successfully neutralized a threat to his kickback scheme and ensured that no one who understood the supply invoices would be in position to expose him. He had no idea. He had no idea that the unstable nurse with a hero complex who'd violated protocol to save Cole Brennan's life had been a decorated Army Ranger captain, trained in every way to operate under pressure, trained to respond to threats with precision and discipline. He had no idea that Elena Martinez was a call sign, not a name. That her 3 years of deference had been a mask so perfectly constructed that he'd seen exactly what he expected to see, a competent but ordinary night shift nurse with a savior complex. That was his mistake. The bus made a right turn onto Roosevelt Avenue, wipers struggling against the rain. Elena stared at the folded flag from Marcus Chen and thought about Tikrit, about the field hospital with walls made of sandbags and prayers, about the 14 casualties she'd treated under direct fire. She'd been a different person then. Younger. Less careful. The kind of operative who dove out of helicopters and didn't ask questions and believed that valor meant something. Now she was sitting on a bus with a cracked coffee mug and a dying plant, heading toward whatever came next, whatever came after your entire existence was classified as burned. The next safe house. The next identity. The next 3 years of being someone she wasn't. She closed her eyes and listened to the rain on the bus windows, the mechanical hum of the engine, the quiet breathing of other passengers who had no idea that they were traveling with a ghost. A woman who'd saved a life and gotten extracted for her trouble. A woman who'd been erased by the very institution she'd been assigned to protect. The rain kept falling. The rain kept falling. 20 minutes. That's all Elena had left before the extraction van pulled up to the service entrance, before JSOC pulled her out of the only life she'd built that didn't require blood on her hands. But that wasn't what happened. The next morning, Dr. Raymond Mercer stormed into Staff Sergeant Cole Brennan's ICU room at 6:53 a.m. with the chief medical officer, 2 hospital administrators in pressed suits, and the legal counsel whose name Elena had never bothered to learn. They came with folders. With documentation. With the careful architecture of a man who'd spent 72 hours building an airtight case for her termination. Mercer's jaw was tight, his voice already rehearsed, the kind of controlled fury that came from believing himself unstoppable. The door swung open. Mercer began speaking before anyone had time to acknowledge the Admiral standing beside Cole's bed. "Good morning, gentlemen. I've prepared a formal statement regarding the unauthorized procedure performed last evening by..." His voice stopped. Cut off mid-sentence. Not by interruption. By recognition. Cole Brennan's eyes had opened. Focused. Fixed on the figure standing in the doorway in yesterday's scrubs, still damp from the overnight shift, her left hand wrapped in fresh gauze where the scalpel had slipped during the thoracotomy. Reaper. Cole's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of a name that had meant something. Meant everything. Meant survival. That's Reaper. The room went dead silent. Standing beside Cole's bed was a man in navy dress whites. 2 stars on his shoulder. Rear Admiral James Brennan, Cole's brother, who commanded Carrier Strike Group 9 out of San Diego, a man who'd flown 16 hours overnight on nothing but a phone call from a brother who'd survived because a woman in scrubs remembered how to keep someone alive when everything else was burning. Next to him stood a 2-star Army general, green beret beneath his arm, the kind of presence that made air pressure change just by existing in a room. Dr. Mercer's face drained of color. Not because he understood. Because he was beginning to. The general opened a folder. His voice was steady, formal, the cadence of someone reading citations at Arlington. Captain Elena Martinez, 75th Ranger Regiment. Silver Star recipient for treating 14 casualties under direct fire during the Second Battle of Tikrit. He paused, letting the weight settle. Surgeon qualified Special Operations medic embedded in Joint Task Force Operations, Eastern Iraq, 2017 to 2019. I don't care about, Mercer's voice cracked. This is hospital protocol. This is about. Sit down, doctor. The Admiral didn't raise his voice. It wasn't a request. It was a command with the weight of a carrier group behind it. Mercer opened his mouth. The Admiral's phone was already at his ear. Yes, sir. Connecting now. Admiral Brennan pressed speaker. Static crackled across the line, then a voice so crisp it could have cut glass. The Fort Sam Houston base commander. The senior medical officer responsible for every military trauma protocol in Texas. I'm standing in a civilian hospital in San Antonio. I'm looking at a physician who appears to have obstructed treatment of an Army Ranger and subsequently filed false documentation to cover that obstruction. The base commander's voice was ice. I'd like to know what the Texas Medical Board intends to do about that. Also, his hospital administrator should know that we're opening a federal investigation into whether his billing practices constitute fraud against TRICARE and Medicare. The legal counsel's face had gone white. What happened in the next 4 hours was the kind of reckoning that moves faster than institutional bureaucracy usually allows. A medical student named Marcus Chen, who'd filmed Dr. Mercer's grand rounds 3 days earlier to use for a case study presentation, had posted the video to TikTok at 8:15 a.m. with the caption, "Found out the doctor bullying this nurse for incomplete documentation was stealing from the hospital. Here's what his arrogance looked like before the world found out." By noon, the algorithm had picked it up. The contrast was too perfect for the internet to ignore Mercer's voice, dripping with condescension, saying, "Did they teach you to write incomplete sentences?" juxtaposed with screenshots of Elena's Silver Star citation, her medical qualifications, her name in official military records. Comments flooded in at a rate the platform could barely track. Military families sharing their own stories. Nurses talking about supervisors exactly like Mercer. Veterans posting combat photos with captions like, "This is who saved lives when it mattered." By 4:42 p.m., the video had 4.2 million views. By 6:22 p.m., Dr. Robert Harrison, Mercer's mentor from Johns Hopkins, the man who'd sponsored his surgical fellowship, the physician Mercer had modeled his entire career around, had sent an email to the Texas Medical Board that landed like a bomb. Not just demanding an emergency review. Personally disowning his protégé in language so devastating it made its way into print before midnight. The physician I trained would never have compromised patient care for ego or profit. That man is a stranger to me now. By 9:15 p.m., the San Antonio Express-News had run Harrison's statement on the front page. By 10:19 p.m., the hospital's forensic audit, triggered by Admiral Brennan's casual phone call to the base commander, had uncovered the phantom shipments. $340,000 in medical equipment that never existed, purchased from a vendor in Austin where Mercer's brother-in-law held equity. 18 months of systematic fraud, carefully buried in interdepartmental requisitions, waiting to be found. The nurses Mercer had reassigned to punish them for loyalty to Elena gave statements. The altered schedules, designed to isolate her during vulnerable shifts, became evidence of deliberate obstruction. His calls to the nursing board, the ones meant to destroy her license before she could expose him, were revealed as retaliation, textbook retaliation, the kind that federal investigators annotate with yellow highlighter. St. Michael's suspended him at 11:52 p.m. By the time the hospital's social media team woke up to check overnight notifications, they were already drowning in calls from news outlets asking for comment. The Texas Medical Board opened a criminal investigation before midnight. His wife had a consultation with a divorce attorney by 6 a.m. the next morning. By 8:24 a.m. on day 2, Dr. Raymond Mercer sat alone in his office, the same office where he'd drafted Elena's termination letter with such careful precision, surrounded by boxes he'd been ordered to pack. His hands were shaking. Not trembling. Shaking. The kind of visceral, uncontrollable shaking that comes from watching your entire constructed reality collapse in real time. His phone buzzed. Buzzed again. Buzzed again. Colleagues he'd trained with, unfollowing him on professional networks. Surgical conferences he'd planned to lead, reassigned to other physicians. A fellowship at Baylor that had been his for the taking, suddenly withdrawn with a terse email about institutional fit. He watched the TikTok video loop on his personal screen. Saw his own face frozen in condescending contempt, his mouth twisted into that smile he'd perfected, the one that made residents flinch. Finally understanding, in real time, how he'd looked to everyone who'd ever stood across from him. Not impressive. Predatory. The thing about institutional protection is that it only works when the institution wants to protect you. And institutions, Elena had learned during her years with the 75th, are made of people. People who watch TikTok. People who have daughters considering nursing school. People who remember what it felt like to be powerless against someone who'd decided you were beneath them. 6 months later, Elena Martinez stood at the window of her new office on the 4th floor of St. Michael's Memorial. The credentials on her wall read Director of Trauma Services. The folded flag from Tikrit hung in a shadow box beside her desk, the flag that had covered her team medic's casket, the flag she'd never stopped carrying. Her left hand still trembled slightly when she was tired, nerve damage from the scalpel grip during that thoracotomy, but it was steady enough for surgery. It would always be steady enough for surgery. Through the window, she watched the loading dock for stories below. A man in a blue company polo shirt, medical equipment vendor logo stitched over the pocket, loaded boxes into a van. Moved slowly. Carefully. Like someone whose spine had been replaced with doubt. Dr. Raymond Mercer's physician's license hung suspended, pending the conclusion of a criminal investigation that had already produced enough evidence for 3 indictments. He was making $19 an hour driving medical supplies to rural clinics in South Texas, the same clinics that would have benefited from his stolen equipment if he hadn't been too busy stealing it. Elena had checked the records once. Couldn't help herself. His name appeared in the logs: delivery driver, contracted third-party vendor, signature required for distribution centers in Corpus Christi, Brownsville, Laredo. Not a physician. Not a surgeon. Just a name on a route sheet. He looked up once. Some instinct, maybe the weight of being observed, made him turn toward the hospital window. Saw her silhouette for stories above. Quickly looked away, shoulders hunching as if the sight of her could pull him under. Cole Brennan was recovering well. The lung had re-expanded fully. No complications. He came to the hospital monthly now, usually with his brother the Admiral, usually talking to hospital administrators about veteran trauma protocols, about expanding the partnership between St. Michael's and Fort Sam Houston. They were building something in Elena's name, not officially, not in the plaques or the press releases, but in the quiet documentation that mattered. Protocols named for the woman who'd saved a ranger's life when every system designed to protect him had failed. The cracked coffee mug that said "World's Okayest Nurse" sat on Elena's desk now, holding pens that needed sharpening. The succulent from the bus stop, the one she'd thought was dying, the one she'd held in her cardboard box during extraction that never happened, was thriving now in the window light. Green and sprawling and impossible to kill. During the press conference announcing the military partnership, a reporter had asked Elena what she'd say to young nurses facing workplace hostility. To people being underestimated by supervisors who'd decided they were beneath notice. She'd taken one measured breath. Let the silence stretch. Allowed her military composure to fill the room like oxygen. The quietest person in the room might be holding it all together. Below, in the loading dock, Mercer closed the van doors. Locked them. Checked his phone for the next delivery route. 6 stops in Laredo. 2 hours of driving. Minimum wage. No benefits. No retirement. No second act. Elena didn't feel triumph. That would have required caring about his fate as anything more than data, a system correcting itself, an institution recognizing predatory behavior and removing the threat. She felt something closer to relief. The kind that comes from watching the world work the way it was supposed to. Not always. Not for everyone. But sometimes. When the evidence was overwhelming enough. When enough people paid attention at once. She had a shift in the trauma bay at 7. 2 residents waiting for her to train them on field techniques, the same techniques that had saved Cole Brennan's life, the same techniques that had painted her as unstable until the 75th Ranger Regiment decided to remind everyone what unstable looked like when it was actually saving lives instead of threatening them. The rain had stopped days ago. The sun was coming back. And Elena Martinez, Captain Elena Martinez, Director of Trauma Services, the woman they tried to bury, was exactly where she was supposed to be. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know who you actually were, please like this video and subscribe to the Code Whisperers. We release new stories every week about the quiet heroes nobody saw coming. Comment below, what would you have done in Elena's position? Would you have walked away or fought back? And if you know a nurse or healthcare worker facing retaliation like this, tag them. Let them know they're not alone.